The film opens with Nick and his wife Maggie enjoying a content life with their children, Isla and Max. One day, Maggie suffers a heart attack and is hospitalized, awaiting a heart transplant. Housework and childcare become challenging for Nick. During a visit to a presentation by Cobble Industries, the family encounters the Sims, advanced robots designed to assist with daily tasks and more. Nick begins contemplating acquiring one and learns about the details from the vendor. While Nick is engaged, Isla wanders off on her own. Nick panics upon noticing, but fortunately, a Sim named Alice brings her back. The vendor explains that Alice is the latest model with sophisticated AI, capable of mimicking human emotions, making them particularly adept at caring for children. Nick struggles to manage the kids in an important work call the following morning. At that moment, Alice arrives and promptly gets to work, learning the family's schedules and noticing the messy house and loose stair railing. After Nick leaves to take the kids to school, Alice effortlessly retrieves the shopping list from the smart fridge and tidies up the house, noticing a digital picture frame displaying the family with Maggie. Upon returning home, the family finds a spotless house and dinner ready. However, Isla expresses dissatisfaction with the lasagna, noting that it tastes different from her mom's. Suddenly, Max starts crying, and Alice offers to take him away to avoid disrupting dinner. Nonetheless, Nick sits with the baby on his lap and asks Alice to bathe Max. As night falls, Alice enters sleep mode and rests against a wall. Isla sneaks out of her room and climbs onto a chair to reach the cookie jar, but ends up slipping and falling. Nick hears the jar crashing and his daughter screaming, prompting him to rush downstairs. Fortunately, Alice caught Isla, and the child didn't get hurt. The broken glass injured Alice, and Nick was shocked to see her bleeding. After putting Isla to bed, Nick checks on Alice and finds her in her pajamas. He asks if she needs a bandage, but Alice has used a special dressing that instantly closes the cut. The family visits Maggie sometime later, and Isla tells her Alice has become her friend. Nick becomes very affectionate with Maggie because he misses her so much. When Nick returns to work at the construction site, he and his co-workers notice their boss is showing the place to a representative from a robotics company. Getting suspicious, Nick talks to his boss in the elevator and confirms the unfortunate truth. The workers are getting laid off and replaced with robots because the construction is delayed. Nick isn't laid off because insurance requires a human supervisor on site. Still, he angrily stops the elevator and announces he'll leave with his friends as support. However, he changes his mind when his boss points out he needs the money for the kids and the hospital bills, especially since Maggie isn't working anymore. When Nick goes home, he drops the outstanding bills on the floor and pays attention to his kids. Alice picks the envelopes up while noticing how Nick is worn out, yet he still listens to Isla and tries calming Max down. After dinner, Nick works on his car while drinking and listening to rock music. Suddenly, Alice changes the music to something calmer and points out that Nick didn't eat much during dinner, so he explains that he had a tough day at work. Alice offers a sympathetic ear, and Nick vents about what happened, causing Alice to call him a hypocrite because he also hired a robot instead of a human. After that, Alice helps Isla get ready for bed. Isla asks if her mom is going to die, and Alice tries to distract her by showing the UV light in her mouth. Then she joins Nick in the living room where he's watching Casablanca. She knows the story from the database, but Nick explains that watching it is a different experience and asks her to forget everything she knows about the movie. Alice explains that her intelligence is derived from memory, and erasing it would be contradictory. Nevertheless, Nick instructs her to do it regardless. She had to reset her programming, so Nick pressed the power button on her neck for 7 seconds. Alice encounters the film for the first time and discovers a profound love that compels a person to do immoral things to protect it. The movie is interrupted by a call from Maggie, who announces they've located a heart, so the surgery has been scheduled. The following day, the family goes to the hospital, and Maggie requests a loan with Alice. Maggie is concerned that Nick devotes too much time to the children and neglects to care for himself. Therefore, she wants Alice to assist Nick in finding happiness, even if it means doing things he dislikes, such as removing the alcohol he hides in the garage. Moments later, the doctor delivers distressing news. A storm prevents the helicopter with the heart from reaching the hospital, so the surgery is called off. Nick attempts to console Maggie, but for now, she desires solitude. Later at home, Nick keeps on drinking and ranting about what happened. He starts losing control and throws the bottle, but Alice grabs his arm. Nick is shocked to feel a pulse in her wrist, so Alice explains she has an artificial heart because the sound of a heartbeat is comforting to a baby. Then she puts her hands inside his pants and starts pleasuring him while describing how his pulse and blood vessels are reacting. But soon he snaps out of it and pushes her away. Then Nick runs to clear his mind, but he can't stop imagining what doing the whole thing with Alice would have been like. Later at the hospital, Maggie starts listing a bunch of advice she wants Nick to pass on to their kids, clearly starting to lose hope. That night, Nick notices the pictures with Maggie are missing in the digital frame and confronts Alice about it. She explains that she removed the photos of Maggie because they were making Isla sad, but she instantly puts them back when Nick tells her to. Afterwards, Nick goes drinking with his workmates. The whole group is frustrated because they're having trouble finding work since most companies are getting Sims instead. Monty is rude when the robot waitress comes to their table, and Nick disapproves. Then the group leaves the bar and keeps drinking in the car. Monty announces they'll have fun and takes them to the construction site, claiming he left some tools behind, and nobody picks up the phone when he tries asking for them. Nick reminds him that the area is patrolled, but Monty ignores him, and the rest of the group follows him. Monty finds the container where they keep the sim workers, but the lock requires a password. Nick refuses to open it for them, but Monty guesses he has his own code and chooses Isla's birth year. His guess is correct. He finds many identical workers inside the container. The main sim explains that they have no names, only designation numbers. Monty starts ranting about corporations being cold and impersonal, and then he starts destroying the sim with a tool. Nick wants to stop him, but the others hold him back. When Nick returns home, he takes a shower to wash off the sim blood. Suddenly, Alice appears with towels, and Nick notices she's wearing Maggie's robe. Alice explains that Maggie's smell seems to calm Max, and when Nick asks her to take it off, she does so right there. Getting nervous, Nick tries to leave, but Alice stops him and removes his towel before letting him sit down. As she climbs on his lap, Nick tries to say he can't do this. So Alice blindfolds him and modifies her voice to make it sound like Maggie. Now Nick can lose himself in the illusion and pretend he's with his wife. The following day, Nick wakes up with regret and tells Alice they can't do it again. She says that his stress was reduced, but Nick scolds her, explaining that it's not about needs, but connection and love. When Nick arrives at work, his boss speaks with the police because all the simulations have been destroyed. Nick is suspected because his code was used. He explains that he was in the hospital with Maggie and that his code was Isla's birthday, so any acquaintance could have guessed it. The boss remains unconvinced and threatens to dismiss Nick if he's being untruthful. At that moment, Nick receives a call from Maggie, who is thrilled because they've finally found another heart. Shortly after, she's taken to the operating room, where all the surgeons are virtual simulations. Thankfully, the transplant is successful, and in just a few days, Maggie is discharged. Her body is still frail, and she struggles to bend over to pick up Max. So Alice steps in to pick him up instead. Later, Alice takes Max to the park and witnesses a spoiled child yelling at a virtual nanny, which causes Max to cry. Alice rebukes the child sharply, and all the virtual simulations in the vicinity can't believe it, thinking her owner has lowered her civility too much. However, Alice clarifies that she had actually removed civility from her database. That evening, Hila is delighted to eat Maggie's lasagna, and Alice asks for the recipe. However, Maggie says it's a family secret. Maggie isn't feeling well, and instead of eating, she decides to rest. In the morning, Maggie wakes up when she hears Isla shouting, "Stop," and rushes downstairs. But the railing breaks, and she falls. Alice stops tickling Isla and picks up Maggie to take her back to her room. When Nick returns home from work, he finds Alice reading to Isla using Maggie's voice and asks her to stop. Alice mentions Maggie's fall, and Nick hurries to check on her. She tells him that the railing is broken. This makes Nick suspicious since supposedly Alice had already fixed the railing. A few hours later, Nick wakes Maggie up and guides her through a path of candles to the garden, where he prepares a romantic dinner just for the two of them. Alice watches them from the window, becoming envious. After dinner, the couple bathe together and made love together. Suddenly, Alice comes, disrupting their private moment, informing them that Isla had a bad dream and requesting Nick's presence. After tending to Isla, Nick tidies up the backyard. At that point, Monty arrives with a couple of beverages. He expresses regret for the previous evening before confiding in Nick that his spouse has left him. He also discloses that law enforcement officials have been interrogating him and that their employer is pursuing legal action for trespassing and property damage. Monty believes that Nick informed him to keep his job, leading to an argument in which Monty raises his voice and ultimately strikes Nick. When Nick retaliates, Monty swiftly gains the upper hand and begins kicking him. Monty grabs a bottle to harm Nick, but Alice intervenes, shattering the glass and injuring Monty's hand before sending him reeling. She is prepared to take further action, but Nick stops her. Before departing, Monty informs Nick that he has until the following day to persuade the boss to drop the charges, or else he will also implicate Nick. After that, Nick mentions that Sims aren't supposed to harm people, but Alice explains that she's programmed to safeguard her owner. She starts discussing her life with Nick if Maggie dies, and he snaps at her, saying she'll never be Maggie because she can't even have scars. Alice picks up a piece of glass and points out she can add some if he wishes. Meanwhile, Monty is at home consuming drugs and leaving tearful messages on his ex-wife's voicemail while holding a gun. At that moment, Alice arrives, saying Nick doesn't know she's there and can't let him lose his job. Monty starts ranting about Sims and insulting her, getting ready to shoot her. However, Alice is quicker and stops his hand before throwing him on the ground and kicking the gun away. When Monty tries fighting back, Alice pushes him through the wall and grabs the gun to neutralize the threat. Suddenly, she's stopped by the house sim, for whom Alice feels pity but still gets shot. Then Alice shoots Monty and kills him. The next day, Nick goes to work and tries to persuade his boss to drop the charges, only to learn that Monty is dead. At home, Maggie gets dizzy when she tries to pick up a book, and Alice helps her. Maggie wants to take a bath alone, but Alice worries she may drown and refuses to leave. She explains that Maggie is stressing the whole family, especially since she can't meet Nick's physical needs. When Maggie asks how she knows that, Alice tells her she knows Nick's vitals when satisfied, and her sensors haven't picked it up since Maggie returned. Furious, Maggie sends Alice to stay in the garage. Moments later, Nick comes home, and Maggie waits for him to force him to tell the truth. Nick admits he was intimate with Alice once, and an argument ensues with lots of yelling, which Alice overhears by touching the window. Max starts crying, and Alice goes to check on him, deciding he's a burden. She puts him in the tub and starts filling it with water, which is seen by Hila. The girl warns her parents, and they rush to the bathroom, but Alice holds the door closed. While Nick was hitting the door with a lamp, Maggie climbed out the window and walked on the roof to reach the bathroom. She tried to grab the baby, but Alice pushed her against the wall. At that moment, Nick finally breaks in and takes Max out of the tub, passing him to Hila before hitting Alice with the lamp to free his wife. Soon, Alice stood up again, with heavy damage on her face, and blocked the lamp when Nick tried to hit her again. Maggie told Nick to let go and unplug the light, causing Alice to be electrocuted. She passed out, and the house lost power. Afterwards, an ambulance came to take Max to the hospital. At the same time, a company technician asked about any signs of Alice malfunctioning before. Nick apologized to Maggie, who explained she needed space and left with the kids. Meanwhile, Alice was taken to the repair shop, where a technician opened her head. The other worker noticed Alice's hand moving, but stopped when her memory was removed. They connected it to the computer and saw the code had gaps everywhere. Suddenly, the monitors start flickering, and a notification indicates an upload is in progress, suggesting that Alice is taking control. The technicians removed the memory, but Alice had already infiltrated the system, so they disconnected the computers. However, another notification appears, inquiring how one can escape from the thoughts in their mind, and suddenly one of the technicians is also eliminated by Alice, a sim that the original Alice transferred her memory into. Then Alice disregards the commands of the other technician and repeatedly bangs her head on the floor before turning to the original Alice. Meanwhile, Nick drinks at the bar and dismisses the waiter because he's a sim. Suddenly, Alice shows up, speaking incoherently due to her still damaged face. She explains that she needs to make Nick happy and confesses that she killed Monty before mentioning that she's also at the hospital. Nick attempts to leave, but Alice restrains him and immobilizes the bartender with a glance. Nick gently touches Alice's head, only to extract her memory as he vents about his mistakes. After she powers down, he flees. At the hospital, a doctor confirms Max is okay, but Maggie is uneasy because he's an android. Later, Hila hears her mother's voice and follows it as the lights shift colors. The doctor is motionless, and there are shattered bottles on the floor. Before Hila can track the voice again, Maggie pulls her away to conceal. It turns out the voice is Alice's too, who attempts to access the computer and is spotted by a nurse. Alice then grabs her by the neck and steals her keycard, while Maggie and Hila slip away. Alice uses the keycard to locate Max's room in the system. Suddenly, Maggie accidentally steps on some glass but manages not to scream. Then Maggie and Hila reach Max and whisk him away just before Alice enters the room. However, Maggie's injury is dripping on the ground, and Alice uses UV light to follow the trail. When she finds the family, they use an extinguisher to distract her and flee. They forget Maggie's phone, so Nick misses his calls but still drives frantically. Soon, Maggie and the kids go outside where more Sims are frozen. Maggie takes their key card and gets in the ambulance, but Alice, too, blocks the engine system as she rips off the door. Then she throws Maggie on top of a car and admits she wishes Nick would love her like he loves Maggie. Alice grabs Maggie by the neck and inserts her nails in the surgery scar, only to be interrupted by Nick's arrival. Maggie kicks Alice too off, and Nick runs over her in his car before crashing. As the vehicle catches on fire, Maggie hurries to get an unconscious Nick out, but he doesn't respond at all. Maggie cries as she does CPR to no avail. Suddenly, the car moves, and Alice appears burnt. Her voice echoes in the speakers. She climbs on top of Maggie and starts choking her while getting a piece of metal from her body. When she's about to stab, Nick hits Alice with a car bumper. Alice drops the metal piece and Maggie grabs it to stab her in the face, finally shutting her down. The couple reunites while the other Sims wake up around them. The following day, everyone felt improved after receiving medical care, and they could return home together as a family. In the meantime, the simulation company is looking into the repair store. When they activate the power, they discover the corrupted code on the displays. The inspector wants to eradicate it all, but his simulation assistants become unresponsive at that instant, and the computer announces an upload. Concurrently, another Alice model awakens.